The station floated in the middle of nowhere. That was the point. Neutral space. No star close enough to claim it. No planet beneath it. Just cold black emptiness in every direction, and a single massive structure hanging in the dark like a lantern left behind by someone who forgot to come back. The Celestial Conclave Station had been built 400 years ago by the Velthari, the oldest of the elder races. It had hosted 312 summits. Every one of them had ended the same way, with the weaker party signing whatever the council put in front of them. The humans arrived on time. That alone surprised the council delegates. Most species kept them waiting as a show of dignity. Humans apparently did not play that game. Their shuttle docked at exactly the agreed hour, and their delegation walked into the grand hall without ceremony, without a fanfare, without even a particularly impressive entrance. 7 people in dark coats, no visible weapons, no elaborate alien-facing clothing designed to impress. Just 7 humans, walking in like they had somewhere else to be. Ambassador General Sira Voss led them. She was not a large woman. She was not the kind of person who filled a room when she walked in, not the way some leaders did, not with noise or energy or dramatic presence. She was calm. That was the word for it. Calm the way deep water is calm, still on the surface, impossible to measure from above. She sat down at the long curved table, folded her hands, and looked at the 11 alien delegates across from her without blinking too much. The hall was extraordinary. The ceiling was so high it disappeared into shadow. Light came from long strips along the walls, a color slightly off from anything humans found natural, giving everything a faint purple-white glow. The air was filtered to suit 11 different species, which made it smell like nothing at all, clean in an artificial way, like the inside of a medical bay. Around the table sat creatures of every imaginable shape. The Velthari elder, Sarathine, had 4 arms and 8 small eyes arranged in a half-circle across a wide, flat face. The Kethvon representative was tall and thin, with joints that bent the wrong way. Others were stranger still. They all looked at the humans with the same expression. It was not respect. It was not hostility, exactly. It was the look of something much simpler and much colder than either of those things. It was the look of people who have already decided the outcome and are only present to record it. Sarathine opened the session. His translator chip rendered his words in smooth, flat English. The council had prepared well. He welcomed the Terran delegation. He acknowledged humanity's growth over the past 2 centuries. He used words like remarkable and unprecedented and spirited, words that sounded like compliments but were arranged in a way that meant something closer to troubling and disruptive, and in need of correction. Then he presented the terms. Sira Voss read them. She read them slowly. She did not react. Her face did not change. The other 6 humans at the table also read their copies, and none of them reacted either, which the council found slightly unsettling, though no delegate said so aloud. The terms were as follows. Humanity would cease all new colonial expansion immediately. Any colony established in the last 30 years that sat within 200 light-years of a council member's territory would be classified as a disputed zone and placed under joint administration, meaning council administration, in practice. The Terran Compact's military fleet would be reduced to 1/4 of its current size, with the decommissioned ships turned over to the council for review and disposal. Human AI research would be paused and open to full council inspection. And finally, buried near the back of the document, in language that was careful and soft and very clearly deliberate, humanity would enter a period of cultural harmonization, a 40-year process by which human customs, education systems, and social structures would be reviewed, and where the council deemed necessary, reformed. That last one was the real point of all the others. Voss finished reading. She set the document down. She looked at Sarathine. She looked at each of the other delegates, one by one, moving slowly around the table. None of them looked away. They were very old, most of them, or represented very old civilizations, and they had learned to hold eye contact with species they were in the process of absorbing. "Do you have questions?" Sarathine asked. "No," Voss said. "The terms are clear." Then we may proceed to the signing period. We won't be signing. The hall went quiet. Not the polite quiet of a pause, the sudden, sharp quiet of something unexpected. Sarathine's 8 eyes blinked in sequence, which was his species' equivalent of a slow double-take. The Keth Vaughn delegate's fingers stopped moving. Even the ambient hum of the station's air systems seemed to pull back, as if the building itself was listening. "I'm sorry," Sarathine said, and there was something in his translated voice that was almost not quite but almost sharp. "Could you clarify?" Voss closed her binder. She did it neatly, pressing the cover down flat, making sure the edges lined up. Then she pushed her chair back and stood up. "The Terran Compact does not accept these terms," she said. Those 7 words landed in the room like stones, dropped into still water. "Ambassador," said the Drekkai delegate, a gray-skinned creature with a voice like grinding gravel, "you understand what noncompliance means for your people." "I understand what these terms mean for our people," Voss said. She was not loud. She did not raise her voice. She spoke the way someone speaks when they are completely sure of what they are saying. "A quarter fleet means we cannot defend our outer colonies. Joint administration of our settlements means we don't govern ourselves. Cultural harmonization," she paused for exactly 1 second, "means you get to decide what it means to be human. We don't agree." "This is not a negotiation," said a delegate from the far end of the table, one of the smaller species, the Venashari, who had a reputation for being blunt even by council standards. "These terms exist because your expansion has created instability. Compliance is not optional." "Then neither is our refusal," Voss said. She picked up her binder. She nodded to her delegation. All 6 of them stood as one, no signal given, no word spoken, just 7 humans rising from their chairs at exactly the same moment in exactly the same way, which somehow made the moment feel more deliberate than any dramatic speech could have. They walked toward the exit. No one stopped them. No one quite knew what to do. This had never happened before. In 312 summits, no delegation had ever simply stood up and walked out. There were contingency protocols for refusal, of course. There were always protocols, but they assumed a back and forth, a process of pressure and counterpressure, demands and concessions. They did not account for a delegation that arrived on time, read the terms quietly, said no, and left. At the door, Voss paused. She turned back just for a moment. The 11 delegates were still sitting in silence, looking at her. "You've done this before," she said. "To the Drekkai, the Solvan, the Kethari. They signed because they were afraid. I understand that." She looked at Sarathine specifically. "We are not afraid of you. That's something you should understand now before this goes further." Then she walked out. The door closed. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Sarathine sat very still. He was 712 years old. He had attended 41 summits. He had watched empires fold and species surrender and civilizations reshape themselves under council guidance. He had seen defiance before. Every species had a moment of it, usually early on, usually quickly corrected. But there had been something in that woman's stillness that he could not place. He turned to his aide, a young Velthari scholar named Myron Saul, who had spent 4 decades studying human history and culture. Myron Saul was one of the few beings in the galaxy who had read the complete human historical archive. All of it. "They don't know what they've just done," Sarathine said quietly. Myron Saul looked at the closed door. He thought about what he had read, the wars that had lasted decades, the sieges that should have ended civilizations and hadn't. The way humans described their own darkest moments in their history, not with shame, but with something that looked, from the outside, almost like pride. Like pressure was not something that broke them. Like pressure was something that made them. He thought about the woman at the table, how still she had been, how her hands had not trembled once. "Elder," Myron Saul said carefully, "I don't think it's them who don't know." Sarathine looked at him. "I think," Myron Saul continued, choosing his words slowly, "that we have been waiting for them to show fear, and they have been waiting for us to show them a reason to." He paused. "We just did." The elder said nothing. On the docking arm of the station, The human shuttle disengaged from its port with a clean mechanical click. Its engines fired small blue lights in the dark, and it moved away from the station without hurry, without drama, at a steady and unhurried pace. It did not look back. It did not need to. Somewhere in the dark, the long count had already begun. Not a countdown to diplomacy. Not a countdown to another summit or another set of terms or another round of careful language. A different kind of count entirely. And the humans, moving through the black at a steady pace toward home, already knew exactly what came next. The first thing the council did was wait. That was always the first move. Patience was something the elder races had in abundance. They had watched civilizations rise and fall over centuries. They understood that pressure, applied slowly and steadily, was more effective than force. Force created martyrs. Pressure created compliance. So they waited, expecting the humans to come back to the table quietly, perhaps with a smaller delegation, perhaps with a slightly more cooperative ambassador, ready to discuss modified terms. The humans did not come back. Instead, they went home and got to work. The news reached Earth 12 hours after the shuttle left the station. By the time Voss's delegation landed at Luna Command, every major broadcast channel across human space was already running the story. The Council's terms had been leaked. Nobody ever found out exactly how, though most assumed it was intentional, and humanity read them. All of them. The colonial reduction, the fleet cuts, the joint administration clauses, and cultural harmonization. That last part was the one that did it. People could argue about fleet numbers. Politicians could debate colonial boundaries. But cultural harmonization, the idea that an alien council had the right to sit down with human children and decide which parts of being human were acceptable, that was not a policy disagreement. That was something older and simpler and far more combustible. Every human who read it felt it in their chest before they thought about it in their head. The reaction was not panic. That surprised the Council's observers, who had predicted protests, internal division, political paralysis. Instead, what happened across human space in the following days was something much quieter and much more dangerous. People started moving. On Earth, in the orbital shipyards above the Pacific, a shift supervisor named Darrow Ellis got a call at 3 in the morning from 47 engineers who were not scheduled to work that day. They wanted to come in. He told them yes. By morning, the yard was running at twice its normal capacity. By the end of the week, 4 other yards had reported the same thing, workers showing up unscheduled, not asking for overtime, not filing paperwork, just showing up. On Mars, the Hellas Basin Manufacturing Complex, the largest in the solar system, began switching over its secondary production lines. They had been making civilian transport frames. Now they were making warship hulls. The order had come from the Compact Defense Council, but the workers had already begun the transition before the official notice arrived. They had read the same news as everyone else. In the outer colonies, the scattered worlds and stations that the Council had labeled disputed zones in their terms, something remarkable happened. 3 colonies that had been in a legal trade dispute for 11 years settled it in a single meeting that lasted 4 hours. 2 station governments that shared an asteroid belt and had argued over mining rights for 2 decades signed a joint defense agreement by the end of the month. A colony on Kepler 9 that had been threatening to secede from the Compact for 3 years voted unanimously to reaffiliate. The Council's intelligence network watched all of this and filed careful reports. Admiral Keth Vaughn, the head of the Council's combined war fleet, read every one of them. He was a careful being, methodical, experienced, not given to emotional reactions. He had overseen 4 military interventions in his career and managed all of them cleanly. He read the reports from human space with the same flat attention he brought to everything. Then he read them again. The numbers were not supposed to add up this way. The models had predicted internal fracture. Humans had a long history of disagreeing with each other, violently, persistently, on nearly every subject imaginable. The assumption had been that the Council's pressure would aggravate existing divisions. Colonies would blame Earth. Political factions would fight over the correct response. The military would argue with the government. The thing would fall apart from the inside before it ever became an external problem. The models were wrong. A new destroyer-class ship took 11 days to complete at the Callisto yards. 11 days. The same hull under normal peacetime conditions took 4 months. The workers were not cutting corners, the ships were passing every inspection. They were simply not stopping. 3 shifts that blurred into each other. People eating at their stations. People sleeping in the break rooms and coming back. There was no mandate forcing them. There was no penalty for going home. They simply did not go home. Keth Vaughn flagged the shipyard report and sent it to the council with a note attached. The note said, in the careful formal language of council correspondence, that the initial assessment of human response capacity may require revision. What he meant, stripped of the formal language, was, we may have made a mistake. The sanctions came next. The council closed 3 major trade corridors used by human shipping. Rare materials that Earth imported from council-adjacent space were cut off overnight. The economic models predicted serious shortages within 8 months: food processing chemicals, medical manufacturing compounds, electronics components. Enough pressure to bring a mid-tier civilization to the table within a year. Humanity's response was to find other suppliers. It should not have been possible that fast. Supply chains do not rebuild overnight. Trade relationships take years to develop, but humans had colonial outposts in directions the council had not fully mapped, connections with smaller independent species that sat outside council jurisdiction, and an apparently bottomless capacity for improvisation when the alternative was losing. Within 6 weeks, 3 new trade routes were operating. They were slower and more expensive than the old ones. Nobody seemed to care. The Sullivan ambassador, whose own species had signed council terms 60 years ago and still quietly regretted it, sent a private message to the Terran Compact through an unofficial channel. The message was short. It said only, "They are watching your R&D stations. Move what matters." The humans had already moved it. That was the thing Keth Vaughn kept returning to, going over the reports late in the station's artificial night. Humans kept doing things before they were supposed to know they needed to do them, not because they had better intelligence. The Council's intelligence network was vastly superior, but because humans seemed to operate on a kind of collective instinct when they felt threatened. They did not wait for orders. They did not wait for official confirmation. They read the situation and they moved. The new propulsion research, the project that the Council's surveillance had been monitoring for years as an interesting theoretical exercise, was suddenly no longer theoretical. A test drive had been conducted at a station near Wolf 359. The data was encrypted, but the energy signature was not. Keth Vaughn's analysts estimated the drive, if functional, would increase human fleet speed by 30%. That number had not been in any model. He called an emergency review session. The session lasted 9 hours. At the end of it, Keth Vaughn stood at the head of the table and looked at his staff and said something that had never been said in that room before. "We need to revise our threat classification for the Terran Compact," he said, "upward, significantly." One of his staff officers, a young Drekkai commander who had trained on Council doctrine and believed in it completely, asked what the new classification should be. Keth Vaughn was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet," he said. "That's what concerns me." Back on Earth, in a long underground complex beneath the Swiss Alps that had been repurposed 3 times across 3 centuries, once as a particle physics lab, once as a government archive, once as a wartime command center, Sira Voss sat at a plain table with a cup of tea and a stack of production reports. The room was not glamorous. The lighting was ordinary. There was a window, but it showed only rock wall. The complex was deep underground. She read the reports the way she had read the Council's terms. Slowly, carefully, without letting her face do anything. When she finished, she set them down. Across the table, the Compact's defense secretary, a heavy-set man named Okafor who had spent 30 years in military logistics, looked at her and asked the obvious question. "Are we ready for what comes next?" Voss picked up her tea. "No," she said, "but we will be. And they don't know when we will be, which is the same thing as being ready. Akefer nodded slowly. Outside the complex, somewhere above the rock and the soil and the clouds, the stars were where they had always been, cold and distant and full of things that had decided, long ago, that humanity was a problem to be managed. They were finding out, slowly and at great cost to their certainty, that they had read the situation wrong. Humanity was not a problem to be managed. It was a problem that managed itself. And it was just getting started. The decision was not made by the whole council. That was the detail that history would remember later, the uncomfortable, inconvenient detail that some of the elder delegates had argued against it, that the vote had not been unanimous, that 2 members had abstained, and 1 had walked out of the session entirely. History would remember it because it mattered, because it meant that what happened next was not the cold, calculated move of a unified ancient power. It was the impatient decision of frightened people who had been watching humanity build and build and build for 9 months, and had decided they needed to make it stop before they no longer could. The target was Kepler-7. It was chosen carefully in the way that revealed everything about how the council thought. Kepler-7 was a farming colony. Population, 62,000. Mostly agricultural workers, some light manufacturing, a small orbital station that served as a trade waypoint. It had a single defense installation, a dozen automated rail guns, and a garrison of 400 soldiers. Not a military target, not a strategic asset, not a place that would matter in any real military sense. That was precisely why they chose it. The message was the point, not the damage. A surgical demonstration. A reminder that the council's reach extended to every corner of human space, that no colony was too remote, that compliance was not optional. They had done this before. When the Sullivan had refused their terms 40 years ago, a single strike on a Sullivan industrial station had ended the standoff within a month. The Sullivan had come to the table, signed, and never openly resisted again. The council expected the same from humans. The strike took 11 minutes. 3 council warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Kepler-7 system, neutralized the defense installation in the first pass, and then, following their orders with precise, professional efficiency, fired on the main population center of the colony's largest settlement. 14,206 people died. Most of them were asleep. It was the middle of the local night. The ships were gone before any response force could reach the system. They left no message, no formal declaration, no communication of any kind. The silence was deliberate. The council wanted humanity to draw its own conclusions, to understand that this was a consequence and not a war, to feel the gap between what they were and what the council was. It did not work. The news hit human space like a physical thing. It moved faster than official channels, through personal communications, through colony networks, through the informal web of human connection that stretched across dozens of worlds and stations. People did not wait for government announcements. They told each other. They sent names. They sent images of the settlement before and after, and those images traveled everywhere at once. For 24 hours there was something that looked, from the outside, like the grief the council had expected. Broadcasts went quiet. Official communications were minimal. The human response in those first hours was silence. And then Sira Voss sat down in front of a camera. She was in the same underground complex beneath the Alps, the same plain room, the same ordinary lighting. She was wearing a dark jacket. There was nothing on the table in front of her except a single sheet of paper, actual paper, printed, the kind that nobody used anymore. She looked at the camera and she did not say anything for a moment. She just looked. Then she began to read. She read names. All of them, every name from Kepler-7. In the order they appeared on the colony registry, which meant roughly alphabetical, which meant the list moved through families, parents and children together, brothers and sisters, people who had lived beside each other for years and had died in the same 11 minutes. She read without stopping, without commentary, without expression beyond the flat, steady effort of reading each name clearly and correctly, making sure every syllable landed right. She had practiced the harder names, the ones from languages she didn't speak natively, until she could say them without hesitation. The broadcast ran for 4 hours and 17 minutes. It was watched live by an estimated 900 million people. Recordings of it spread to every human installation in known space within 48 hours. People watched it in full. They sat with it. They did not look away. When she reached the last name, a 7-year-old girl named Amara Osaibansu, listed last because her colony registration had been filed late, Voss set the paper down. She looked at the camera. "We remember all of them," she said. "You will remember all of us." Then the broadcast ended. The Compact Defense Council met 6 hours later. The session was short. The vote was taken. Every representative from every colony, every station, every territorial government in human space cast the same vote. The Terran Compact declared war on the Galactic Council. Unanimously. There was no dramatic announcement afterward, no speech about glory or destiny. The official declaration was a legal document, filed through proper channels, transmitted to the Council through every available diplomatic frequency. It was written in plain language. It stated that the Council's strike on Kepler-7 constituted an act of war. It stated that the Terran Compact considered itself in a state of armed conflict with the Council and its member states. It stated that this would continue until the Council acknowledged full Compact sovereignty and accepted accountability for what had happened at Kepler-7. It was 3 paragraphs long. The Council received it and immediately convened an emergency session. Myron Saul, the young Velthari scholar who had studied humans for 40 years, was not invited to that session. He was an aide, not a delegate. He sat outside the chamber and waited, the way aides always waited, and he thought about what he knew. He thought about a concept he had found in the Human Historical Archive, years ago, that had no direct translation in any language he knew. The humans called it a rallying point. A moment so clear and so wrong that it removed all ambiguity, all internal division, all the noise of ordinary disagreement. A moment that made an entire people look in the same direction at the same time. The Council had been trying to divide humanity for 9 months. Sanctions designed to set colonies against Earth. Trade cuts designed to make outer settlements feel abandoned by the Compact. Delays and pressures calibrated to create the kind of fractures that already existed in human society and make them worse. They had been succeeding slowly. There had been arguments, political tensions. A colony governor on the Kepler belt had given a speech about the Compact not doing enough to protect the outer worlds. 2 Earth factions had publicly disagreed about the right response to the sanctions. And then the Council had bombed a sleeping farming colony and killed 14,000 people, including a 7-year-old girl whose name an ambassador had read aloud to 900 million people. All of that fracture closed overnight, like a wound that seals under pressure. Myron Saul sat outside the chamber and pressed his fingers together and thought, "We gave them the one thing they needed. We gave them a reason to agree." Inside the chamber, Keth Vaughn was presenting the updated military projections. The numbers were not good. In 9 months, human shipyard output had increased by 340%. Their active fleet had grown from a significant regional force into something that did not have a comfortable category in Council strategic doctrine. The new drive systems were confirmed operational on at least 40 vessels. Human colonial defense forces had been reorganized and integrated under a single command structure, which meant they now functioned as a unified military rather than a collection of territorial garrisons. And then there was the morale problem. Keth Vaughn did not use that word exactly. He said cohesion factor and motivational variables, but what he meant was simple. A human military fighting to avenge 14,000 dead civilians, with the names of those civilians read aloud to the entire species, was not the same military they had been modeling against. The numbers on paper were one thing. What those numbers would do under the weight of that kind of anger, organized and directed and backed by an entire civilization that had unified around a single moment of absolute clarity. That was something the models could not fully calculate. "Can we win this?" asked one of the delegates. Keth Vaughn looked at the projection on the wall behind him. The lines and numbers that represented, in the dry language of strategic analysis, a civilization that had been given every reason to fight and no reason to stop. He thought about the woman reading names for 4 hours without stopping. "Not quickly," he said, "and perhaps not at all." The room was very quiet. Outside, in the cold dark between stars, human ships were already moving into position, not with noise, not with threats or declarations beyond the one plain document already filed and transmitted. Just moving, steady and certain, the way the shuttle had moved away from the station 9 months ago. Unhurried, purposeful, absolutely sure of where they were going. War for the elder races was a formal thing. It had rules, not written rules, not exactly, but understood ones patterns that had developed over thousands of years of conflict between civilizations that had been fighting each other long enough to learn how it was supposed to go. Fleets met at established engagement points. Supply lines followed predictable corridors. Commanders made decisions according to doctrine that had been refined over generations. There was a shape to war, the same way there was a shape to diplomacy, and the shape was something the elder races understood deeply and completely. Humans did not fight that way. The first major engagement happened 6 weeks after the declaration of war, at the edge of a system called Vela 3, which sat at the boundary between human colonial space and the nearest council member's territory. Keth Vaughn had positioned a significant fleet there, not enough to invade, but enough to establish a blocking position, to prevent human expansion in that direction, and to force any human offensive to work around it. The human fleet arrived, and immediately did something that made no tactical sense. It split, not into 2 groups or 3, but into 11 separate elements of wildly different sizes, which then moved in 11 different directions at speeds that varied so much they seemed to have no coordinated plan at all. Keth Vaughn's tactical staff watched the movement patterns for 4 hours, trying to identify the human strategy. They ran it through 3 different predictive models. Every model gave a different answer, because the movements did not fit the logical framework of any established doctrine. Then the smallest human group, 12 ships, barely worth nodding against his fleet of 200, flew directly at his command formation. Not to attack, to draw attention. Because while every sensor array was tracking those 12 ships, 47 human vessels came out of an uncharted microfold point that Keth Vaughn's charts had listed as impassable and hit his fleet from behind. He lost 30 ships in 9 minutes. He retreated, in good order, efficiently minimizing further losses. The engagement was, by objective measurement, a moderate tactical defeat, not catastrophic, manageable. But that was not what shook his staff. What shook his staff was the debrief afterward, when they tried to reconstruct the human plan and realized there had not been a plan in the traditional sense. There had been a setup and then an improvisation. The humans had probed, read his response in real time, and reacted to what they found. The commander of that human force had not been following a battle plan. She had been making decisions on the fly, based on how Keth Vaughn's fleet moved, and she had been faster at it than his entire tactical staff operating collectively. This happened again at Sigma 9, and at the Drekkai border, and at the engagement the humans called the Battle of the Pale Corridor, which lasted 11 days and involved 17 separate skirmishes, none of which followed the pattern of the one before it. Keth Vaughn's staff started calling it the adaptation problem. Every time they developed a counter to a human tactic, the humans stopped using that tactic. Not slowly, immediately, as if they were reading council battle manuals over someone's shoulder and writing corrections in the margins. Humans had been at war with each other for their entire recorded history. Thousands of years of fighting themselves, every possible terrain, every possible technology level, every possible scale from single combat to global conflict. They had libraries of it. They had studied it, broken it apart, argued about it, revised it, fought about the revisions. They had more institutional knowledge of warfare than any other species in the galaxy, because no other species had spent so much of its existence doing it. Against other species, Council doctrine worked because the Council had more experience with interstellar warfare than anyone else. Against humans, the experience gap ran the other way, and it ran deep. Then came the broadcasts. It started quietly. A human communications team, not military, just a civilian crew attached to one of the forward fleets, began transmitting on frequencies used by the Council's subject species. Not propaganda exactly, just information, records of the Conclave Summit, the original terms laid out plainly, the history of other species that had signed similar terms and what had happened to them afterward, Solvan culture before and after their 40 years of harmonization, the changes that had been made, the things that were gone. The Drekkai received these broadcasts. So did the Solvan. So did 4 other species that sat inside the Council's sphere of influence and had been sitting inside it long enough to have complicated feelings about it. Myron Saul had predicted this. He had written a memo about it 18 months before the war began, back when he was still just an aide studying human history in the quiet of an archive. The memo had said, in careful academic language, that humanity's most dangerous quality was not its military capacity or its industrial output. It was the fact that humans talked to everyone. They made contact with every species they encountered. They traded, they argued, they told stories, they asked questions. They treated communication as inherently worthwhile, which meant they had relationships the Council did not know about, an influence that did not appear in any strategic map. Nobody had read the memo carefully enough. The Drekkai were the first to move. Their government did not defect openly, that would have been too dangerous, too direct. But they began to slow-roll their military contributions to the Council fleet. Ships that were supposed to arrive at staging points were delayed for maintenance. Supply shipments were rerouted through longer paths. Small things, individually explainable, collectively unmistakable. Then the Solvan ambassador, the same one who had sent the private message about the R&D stations, gave a public speech on Solvan home territory. He spoke about the terms they had signed 40 years ago. He spoke about cultural harmonization from the inside, from the experience of a species that had lived through it. He was careful. He did not say anything that was technically a violation of the agreements his people had signed. But he said enough. 3 Solvan ships joined the human fleet at the Pale Corridor 3 weeks later, not officially. The Solvan government did not acknowledge it, but the ships were there. Sarathine, watching from the deep Council station where he had retreated as the war expanded, finally called Myron Saul into his chamber. The elder looked older than he had at the summit. Something had changed in his face, not physically, but in the way he held himself, the way his 8 eyes moved when he was looking at something difficult. He had been reading the archive, all of it. The thing his aide had compiled over 40 years of study. He had been reading it slowly at night. In the silence of a station that was running on reduced staff, because 3 of its support species had quietly stopped sending personnel. "Tell me what you saw," Sarathine said. "When you studied them, the thing you tried to tell me and I didn't hear." Myron Saul stood across from him and thought about where to begin. He thought about Thermopylae, 300 soldiers holding a pass against an army because someone had to and they decided it was them. He thought about a place called Dunkirk, where a Navy evacuation failed and civilians in small boats went out into a war zone to finish the job. He thought about Stalingrad, a city that was destroyed completely and never surrendered. He thought about the moon siege of 2089, which humans had won from a worse position than the one they were in now. He thought about the pattern underneath all of those stories. The same thing, over and over, in different centuries and different conflicts. A species that did not have an upper limit on what it would endure to protect something it decided mattered. A species that found, under pressure, that it had more in it than it knew. "They don't have a ceiling," Myron Saul said simply. "We kept looking for the point where they would stop. There isn't one. The harder things get, the more they produce. The more they lose, the more unified they become. Everything we did to weaken them made them stronger. He paused. We have been trying to fight a fire by adding wood. Sorathine was quiet for a long time. Outside the station's observation window, the stars were cold and still. In the distance, somewhere out along the human border, 3 more Council-aligned ships had just gone silent, not destroyed, just not responding, their crews having made a private decision that their commanders had not authorized and could not reverse. "What do we do?" Sorathine asked. It was the first time in 712 years that he had asked anyone that question and genuinely not known the answer. Myron Saul looked at the stars. "We talk to them," he said. "Differently this time, we go to them and we don't bring terms." The invitation came from the human side. That was the first surprise. The Council had been preparing its own request for a ceasefire, carefully worded, structured to preserve as much dignity as possible, designed to look like a mutual pause rather than a surrender. They had been drafting it for 3 weeks, debating every sentence, every phrase, every implication of every word. Then the Terran Compact sent a message. It was short. It said that Ambassador General Sira Voss was prepared to meet with Council representatives at the Celestial Conclave Station at a date and time of the Council's choosing. It said the purpose of the meeting was to discuss a permanent resolution. It said the compact would arrive with a full delegation. It said there was no precondition for attendance. It was signed by Voss personally, in her own name, the way humans sometimes did when they wanted something to feel less like a government document and more like something a person meant. The Council agreed within 24 hours. The date was set, 3 weeks out. In those 3 weeks, Myron Saul watched the elder races prepare for the summit with something between exhaustion and grief. 6 of the Council's 11 member states had either defected openly, withdrawn their military contributions, or signed separate ceasefire agreements with the Compact directly. The Council still existed, technically. The structure was still there, but it was a hollowed thing now, and everyone inside it knew it. Keth Vaughn submitted his formal assessment before the summit. It was the most precise document he had ever written, 20 pages of analysis that added up, at its core, to a single conclusion. The war could not be won, not in any time frame that made sense, not at any cost the remaining Council members were willing to pay. Human industrial output had not slowed. Their fleet had not shrunk. Their colonies had not fractured. Every month of continued conflict would cost more than the month before. The assessment was accepted without debate. There was nothing to debate. The human delegation arrived on the day, at the agreed time. They came in 3 ships, large ones, military, but with no weapons powered. They docked with quiet precision at the main arm of the Conclave Station, and when the airlock opened, Sira Voss walked out first. She was the same person who had walked out of this station 26 months ago. She had the same calm, the same steady pace, the same quality of taking up exactly the space she needed and no more. There was a long scar along her jaw now, running from the edge of her chin to just below her left ear, a mark from the Battle of Proxima, where her command ship had taken a direct hit and she had been in the forward section when it happened. She had not had it removed. She wore it the way she wore everything else, without comment. Behind her came 6 members of her delegation, and behind them something new. Representatives from 3 other species walked into the Conclave Station alongside the humans. A Sulvan delegate in the formal blue of their home government, officially, this time, with papers and authorization and everything visible and acknowledged. A Drekkai officer in dress uniform, her credentials signed by the Drekkai Council of Worlds. And a small, quiet being from a species called the Kethari, who had been under Council oversight for 90 years, and had spent the last 8 months coordinating with human fleets along the outer border. They sat down together, not opposite the humans, with them. The Council's remaining 5 delegates were already at the table. Sorathine was there. He looked at Voss and she looked at him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The last time they had sat across from each other, he had been certain of everything and she had surprised him completely. Now they were both just people in a room, tired, with something difficult ahead of them that needed doing. Voss sat at the head of the table. She did not make a speech about it. She did not gesture to it or acknowledge it or do anything that would make the moment feel theatrical. She simply sat where the situation placed her, which was at the head of the table, and put her hands flat on the surface and waited for the room to settle. Then she opened her binder and took out a single document. The Terran Accords, 22 pages. It had been drafted over 3 months by a team of human legal scholars, diplomats, and historians, with input from the Sulvan and Drekkai representatives and 2 other species that had been quietly consulting with the compact for over a year. It had been rewritten 11 times. It was the most carefully considered document Voss had ever read, and she had read it completely 6 times before this morning. She slid it across the table to Sarathine. "Take your time," she said. The elder picked it up. He read slowly, the way very old beings read, not because they are slow, but because they have learned that speed is rarely worth the cost of missing something. His aide, Myron saw, read alongside him. The other council delegates read their own copies. The document was not what they had expected. It was not a list of punishments. It was not a reversal of the original terms humanity demanding that the council now disarm, now submit to oversight, now accept harmonization in the other direction. That was what the council had feared, in the deep private fear they had not spoken aloud. That humanity would do to them what they had tried to do to humanity, because that was what powerful civilizations did when they won. Instead, the Terran Accords established a new framework for interspecies relations. It recognized the full sovereignty of every signatory species. It prohibited any party from imposing cultural, military, or administrative terms on another without mutual consent. It created a new joint council, not the Galactic Council, something different, something built on equal representation rather than seniority, where disputes could be brought and resolved through process rather than pressure. It had enforcement mechanisms, real ones, not the kind that depended on the goodwill of the powerful, and it named, plainly in the section on enforcement, the Terran Compact as the guarantor of last resort, the party that would act if the framework was violated. Not because humans wanted to rule. The document was clear about that. Because someone had to be willing to act, and the only species that had ever made the Council afraid was the only species the Council would believe. Sarathine read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at Voss. "You could have asked for more," he said. "We know," she said. "Why didn't you?" She was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she was choosing how to say it. "Because we've read our own history," she said finally. "We know what happens when the side that wins decides the victory is the point. We've done it to each other enough times to know how it ends." She looked at him steadily. "We don't want an empire. We never did. We want to be left alone to be what we are, and we want everyone else to have the same thing." Sarathine looked at the document. He thought about 712 years. He thought about 312 summits and every species that had sat across from him and signed whatever he put in front of them. He thought about what he had built, and what it had cost, and what it had ultimately produced, a structure so rigid and so certain of itself that it had not recognized a threat until the threat had already changed the shape of the galaxy. He thought about Myronsal's memo, sitting unread in a file somewhere, written years before any of this had to happen. He picked up the pen. He signed. The other council delegates signed after him, one by one. The Sulvan delegate signed. The Drekkai officer signed. The Kethori representative signed, slowly and carefully, with the particular attention of someone who has waited 90 years for this specific moment. When it was done, Voss closed the binder and stood up. "There's a reception arranged in the East Wing," she said. "Food from 12 different species. The Sulvan brought something they call festival bread. I'm told it's significant." A pause, very small. "I'd like it if everyone came." Some of them smiled. Some did not know how. All of them stood. Outside the station, arranged at a distance that was respectful but unmistakable, 104 human warships held position in the dark. No weapons active. No aggressive posture. Just present the way a promise is present, something you can feel even when it isn't speaking. They had not fired a shot in 3 weeks. They would not fire one now. The war was over and they were already doing what human fleets did when there was no one left to fight. They were waiting to make sure the peace held. On the station, in the East Wing, the sound of different languages began to fill the room, halting attempts at each other's words, translation chips working overtime, someone laughing at a miscommunication that turned out to be harmless. Myron Saul stood at the edge of the room and watched. He had spent 40 years studying humanity and he had understood them, he thought, fairly well. He had understood their history, their patterns, their capacity for endurance and adaptation and collective will. He had read everything. But there was one thing that was different to understand from the inside rather than from the archive. One thing that was hard to convey in a memo or a strategic report or 40 years of careful academic study. He watched Voss hand a piece of Sullivan Festival bread to Sarathine, who held it like he wasn't sure what to do with it, and she showed him, and he ate it, and something in the old elder's face shifted very slightly in a direction it had probably not gone in a long time. What Myron Saul had not been able to fully explain, in all his years of study, was this. Humans were frightening when they fought, but they were something else entirely when they decided to stop. They were when they chose to be, relentlessly, almost aggressively kind. And somehow, after everything, after the walkout and the sanctions and the bombs and the war and the names read aloud for 4 hours in a plain underground room, that was the thing that would last the longest. That was the thing that would change everything. Outside, the stars were cold and quiet and full of species that were, for the first time in a long time, trying something different. The ships held their position. The peace held. And humanity, as it always had, got back to work.